Romance, matters of the heart, in all of the arts and our lives. Where did this chimera come from? Does romance come naturally to us, or is it rooted in something else? Politics? Status?
From noblemen to kings and queens, ladies and gentlemen, what on earth is romance?
The expectations for love in the modern day world differs to how it used to be. In fact, there was a time in history where someone's feelings were not even considered when choosing a romantic partner, if we would even call it romantic. Society has shifted in many ways.
Once an unattainable plate to many, times have changed. To find out where that fairy tale like love, or even just going beyond anything platonic love, we will only find that answer if we take a journey back into the past.
During the early Middle Ages, marriage was primarily an economic social contract rather than an emotional one. Families arranged marriages to secure alliances and strengthen social power. Attraction and love were secondary and barely even considered compared to modern times. Societies were extremely hierarchical, and it was all about class. The four main groups of society all had a significant role to play and responsibilities to uphold, whether you were rich or poor. Life followed a set rhythm. As a result, the concept of romantic love was not even a prominent consideration. In the early Middle Ages, societies in Europe and other regions had clear, distinct social structures. The feudal system. The feudal system was a political social system in medieval times that structured society around relationships of service, loyalty, and land ownership. We need to understand the groups of people in that time below the kings and queens. One of those groups was the nobility group, full of noblemen and women. They controlled the land and power. Then you had knights. Knights provided military service in exchange for protection and land. The clergy group led religion and had a significant influence socially. Peasants worked the land in return for protection and a way for them to earn a living. Life was divided and harsh, and society had its strict set of rules, with peasants and lords and others set to be a certain way. And life was even tough on people from a higher class. For example, a nobleman's life pertained to the feudal system. Though they were granted to live in manors and estates, noblemen were expected to provide military service to the kings in times of war. Oftentimes, the leaders in battle, a huge responsibility. They had no choice but to be courageous and militant. The average working class man who was looked at as a peasant in that time had little to no recognition from anyone beyond his family. They were viewed in a certain way for practicality purposes and survival, working in the fields, building structures to sustain their families, not viewed as individuals with their own autonomy. And even kings and queens became a unit for social power. It was extremely idealistic. A cultural shift then occurred, and this shift happened in the 12th century. The Crusades. The Crusades, which occurred during the 11th to 13th centuries, were a series of political and religious wars between Christians and Muslims. The Crusades brought Europeans into contact with the Islamic world and other cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean.
This exposed the Europeans to storytelling traditions, tales from Arabic, Persian sources and other cultures, such as 1001 Nights. These romances included enchanted objects and grand quests, and even magical creatures. This then sparked the idea for chivalry and heroism, as these tales had notions of leadership and knighthood. To add, these legends that were told were full of exotic scenes and fantastical elements, far-off lands that were full of mystery. The Crusades glorified the image of the knight as a hero to his people. Poetry was deeply rooted in Arabian culture, long before Islam, as was a dominant art form. Islamic storytellers in that time imbued their stories with moral lessons to make them more aligned with their religious beliefs. And then the idea of courtly love came into play. Courtly love was definitely something. In the Middle Ages, marriages, even for noblemen and women, their ties were centered around socio-political alliance more than deep infatuation. Courtly love relationships were based around dancing and flirting, and the strong efforts of knights, who were also oftentimes noblemen, to win the favor of noble women. Knights practiced courtly love to a woman who was usually married. It was a non-physical, idolized love. Even women had their courtly love affairs going, but these relationships were kept a secret. In this time, adultery was not accepted, especially with the heavy influence of Christianity. But it wasn't uncommon for noblemen and women to engage in extramarital relations. But these affairs were hidden behind the curtain of courtly love. Courtly love rules and characteristics included the chivalric code. This meant to be noble, respectful, protective over a lady. Secrecy, refined manners, politeness, courtesy. Non-physical, emotional affection. Servitude to the lady. To have a spiritual connection. Chrétien de Troyes is said to have been one of the early founders of Romantic tradition. He wrote stories that were inspired by King Arthur. His stories incorporated quests, themes of love, and also had supernatural elements. Marie de France was a 12th century poet that wrote short poems about courtly love, blended with magical elements. A knight falling in love with a lady with mystique called Lanville, one of her tales. Celtic folklore influenced the romantic fantasy storytelling. The High Middle Ages adopted the idea of romance from the influence of Christian values, morals, literature, and the new founded ideal of chivalry. The courts of the nobility group became hubs for noblemen and women and knights to create artistic works which pushed the development of courtly love. These tales then started to circulate and appeal to the aristocrats, the higher-ups, the elite. This courtly love ideal offered an idealized reflection of their lives. It regarded their lives as perfect. Courtly love often incorporated separation and the knight's willingness to endure pain and suffering for a lady. More and more troubadours, meaning French medieval poets, were producing literary at a rapid rate. These poems spread from southern France to northern France and across Europe. Courts meaning full of noblemen and women, the higher-ups.
Only the upper class practiced this kind of relationship and had access to these tales and poems that were being produced. This new phenomenon, called courtly love, included humility, courtesy, admiration, non-physical ties, had a significant impact on the feudal system. Blended with chivalry, the noblemen and women and knights' roles changed. The concept of the knight changed, whose love and great admiration was directed at a lady, helped to elevate the status of the knight in society. Knights were sought to prove their bravery, which was inspired by the legends and tales they had heard. This was seen as significant in that time. And young noblemen or knights would then go on to receive an education that went beyond the distinct training to be in the military. It included social etiquette, courtly behavior, and literary education. Manners became synonymous with knights and noblemen. Politeness, courtesy, acts of bravery were expected of these men. Poets and musicians continued to write songs that dealt with themes of courtly love, unattainable love. Romantic fantasy in the Middle Ages, which pertained to literature, created an idealized image of masculinity. These ideals suggested love should be pure and noble. Men were supposed to be protectors of women and the weak, and be heroic to his people. Romantic fantasy was simply an escape from society. Many of these tales were created by men, and also women too. Women were viewed as the object of a knight's affection and devotion, and it was a platonic admiration. Women were seen as symbols of virtue, purity, to be ladylike. And in this time, it was alliterated that young boys and young girls were raised to be these two things. Noblemen trained with the militant side, but also with being noblemen, to be truly noble.
Romantic ideals eventually spread to the masses, but that happened gradually. The poets and musicians who composed songs about courtly love only sang in the courts of the nobles, but eventually began to perform in public in places like markets. This introduced romantic ideals to the masses. Romantic tales from the nobility courts circulated down to the everyday folk through oral storytelling. They knew the simplified versions of these tales, and they would blend these ideals with their own isms. In the late Middle Ages, the invention of printing press came about, and finally, romantic literature became accessible. In the late Middle Ages, theatre became popular and became another medium for spreading romantic ideas. Initially, a concept that was strictly tied to courtly love, only owned by the elite, spread to common people, which influenced modern conceptions of what love is. Romantic fantasy grew and grew. It continued into fairy tales and modern-day courting practices, like buying flowers and opening doors. Romantic fantasy changed the perception of love. It allowed men to have something to strive for in a dignified way. Many would say that romance is simply a facade, but others might say that it's a way for them to escape from the reality of the real world that can be very harsh. Romantic fantasy changed relationships. A type of literature that depicts romantic fantasy, yet so influential within our everyday lives. Thank you for watching.
and I hoped you enjoyed the story of romance.